The king, Charles X, the anointed successor to the Sun King, rode in a pathetic column of carriages toward the coast, an old man exiled by the very people his grandfather had enslaved with silk and spectacle. The ultimate paradox, the dynasty that had declared itself ordained by God to rule France absolutely, had now been twice and finally rejected by its people. Yet its cadet branch reigned, and still reigns, 1,000 miles away in Madrid. A lineage founded on a tactical conversion and built on the most colossal palace in Europe was now nothing more than a ghost and a cautionary tale. How had this happened? This final humiliating flight from the July Revolution of 1830 was the destination. But the road began in the mud and blood of the 16th century, with a man who laughed at a mass and then chose to take it. The year was 1593. France was not a nation. It was a patchwork of warring faiths and exhausted armies, drowning in the 40-year fever dream known as the Wars of Religion. The Catholic League, backed by Spanish gold and fanatical conviction, held Paris, spitting on the very idea of a Protestant king. Yet the man who is by all legal and dynastic right the King of France, Henri de Navarre, was indeed a Huguenot, a Calvinist who had survived a childhood of constant warfare, the horrors of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and a dozen plots on his life. Henri, dark-haired and hook-nosed, but possessing an electrifying common touch that charmed even his enemies, was besieged at Saint-Denis. He looked upon the towering spire of Notre Dame, a symbol of the city he needed but could not take by force. His legitimacy was flawless. His religion was treason. His ancestral line stemmed from Louis IX, St. Louis himself, through the younger son, Robert, Count of Clermont. This cadet line, the House of Bourbon, had waited over 3 centuries for the main Valois line to die out. Now that it had, the prize was within reach, yet untouchable. His advisors, the politiques, men who prioritized the stability of the state over the purity of the faith, pressed him. "Sire, a crown is worth a mass," whispered the cynic, the chief minister, who saw past theology to the tactical truth. The war had bled the countryside dry. To continue was to invite the Spanish, under Philip II, to carve France up into a collection of vassal states. The alternative was a single, painful political lie. He loathed it. He had fought his entire life for the right to believe as he chose, but he was also a king who understood survival. His personal beliefs could not be allowed to destroy his kingdom. The choice was stark: remain a pious heretic and lose France, or become a politically convenient Catholic and save it. He chose the latter, but with a cynicism that would define the next 2 centuries of Bourbon rule, a willingness to sacrifice sincerity on the altar of royal prerogative. On July 25, 1593, Henri entered the Basilica of Saint-Denis. The atmosphere was thick with tense, skeptical silence. He stood before the Archbishop of Bourges, publicly renouncing his Calvinism. "I abjure the heresy. I promise and swear to live and die in the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion." The conversion was a spectacular, almost theatrical event, designed for maximum political impact. The act secured his legal right to Paris, and with Paris, France. He was crowned Henri IV at Chartres, not Reims, a further snub to the League, and finally rode into Paris the following year. The gates opened not to a conquering army, but to a king who had essentially purchased his capital with his soul. The people of Paris, starving and exhausted, cheered. They cheered the end of the siege, the promise of bread, and the man who, in a classic display of Bourbon charm, declared, "I have changed my shirt, not my heart." Henry IV established the foundational contract of the French Bourbons, absolute power buttressed by Catholic orthodoxy but wielded with a pragmatism that bordered on self-interest. He issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting rights to the Protestants, proving that his conversion was a policy, not a conversion of spirit. He ushered in a period of peace, focused on rebuilding the shattered economy, famously wishing to ensure that every peasant should have a chicken in his pot every Sunday. But the seed of the dynasty's ultimate destruction was planted with his triumph. By converting, Henry IV had neutralized the power of religion to stop a king. By successfully centralizing power and laying the groundwork for the absolute monarchy, he eliminated all other effective checks on royal authority: the nobility, the judiciary, and the populace. The Bourbon crown was now a solitary and heavy weight, unsupported by any shared national framework other than the king's own unchallengeable will. His reign was tragically cut short by the knife of a Catholic zealot, François Ravaillac, in 1010. The assassin hated his pragmatism, his tolerance, and the perceived heresy in his heart. Henry IV died a Catholic king killed by a Catholic extremist, leaving a 9-year-old son, Louis XIII, and a dynasty now firmly in possession of an absolute throne. The foundations were laid, a powerful, centralized, and deeply ambitious monarchy. The next 2 generations of Bourbons would elevate this power to a divine, unquestionable status. But in securing the crown through a strategic lie, Henry IV had shown the dynasty how easily principles could be sacrificed for power, establishing a dangerous precedent that ultimately, over a century later, would cost his descendants their heads. The Bourbon sun was rising, casting long shadows of debt and resentment that Louis XIV would fail to see in his gilded halls.
Henry IV's death left France in the hands of a child king, Louis XIII, and a politically weak regency. However, the subsequent reigns would see the Bourbon project of absolute power completed, culminating in the dazzling, tyrannical reign of Louis XIV, a man who believed without qualification that he was God's direct representative on earth. This chapter marks the zenith of the dynasty's power, but also the structural failure that would doom it, the conflation of the state's finances with the king's personal glory. Louis XIII, guided by the cold, brilliant iron will of his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, spent his reign meticulously dismantling the remaining checks on royal power. The great Huguenot strongholds were razed, and rebellious nobles were humbled, imprisoned, or executed. The state's apparatus, intendants, councils, and bureaucracy was ruthlessly centralized under Paris's control. Richelieu's goal was simple: raison d'etat. The interests of the state were paramount, and the king embodied the state. When Louis XIII died in 1643, leaving another child king, the 5-year-old Louis XIV, the country briefly rebelled. This civil war, known as the Fronde, 1648 to 1653, was the final convulsive attempt by the aristocracy and judiciary to assert their ancient privileges against the centralizing monarchy. The young Louis XIV was forced to flee Paris. This traumatic, humiliating experience, being chased from his own capital, burned an indelible lesson into the child's mind. Never trust the nobility, and never rely on Paris. When Louis XIV finally took full control of the government in 1661, following the death of his second powerful chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, he was ready to implement the lesson. He famously declared, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. He would rule without a chief minister, surrounding himself instead with talented but low-born men like the financial genius Jean-Baptiste Colbert and the military strategist Marquis de Louvois. His first and most enduring action was the construction of Versailles. Versailles was not merely a palace, it was a political machine, an economic black hole, and the grandest theater of power ever conceived. Built on what was once a hunting lodge outside the inconveniently populated and often rebellious Paris, Louis forced the entire high nobility to relocate to its gilded cages. The routine of court life was transformed into a sacred, rigid ritual centered entirely on the king. To hold his shirt, to pass him water, to be present at his lever, waking, or his coucher, going to bed, these were the new measures of a noble's importance. The once dangerous, politically ambitious dukes and princes were reduced to competing for the trivial honor of handing the king his waistcoat. They were kept physically close, under the king's constant scrutiny, and strategically bankrupting themselves to afford the elaborate clothing and life demanded by the court standards. Their political power was replaced by social prestige. Under Colbert, the French economy flourished for a time. Commerce, industries, and overseas colonies were aggressively promoted through mercantilist policies, exporting more than importing to maximize national gold reserves. The army, reformed by Louvois, became the largest and most professional in Europe, leading the continent in military engineering and drill. French culture, its language, fashion, literature, and architecture became the unquestioned European standard. The Sun King's glory was real, and his reach was immense. However, the Bourbon system carried two fatal flaws, both deeply entrenched by Louis XIV. The monolithic image. Louis XIV equated his personal glory with the nation's welfare. His immense need for spectacle and validation meant that nearly every policy, from the Galerie des Glaces to the endless succession of wars, was designed to elevate his personal status. The cost was immaterial. Financial ruin. The state's treasury was treated as the king's personal purse. The wars of expansion, primarily the disastrous War of Spanish Succession, which drained millions, were financed by crippling taxes that fell almost entirely on the poor and middle class, the Third Estate, while the clergy and nobility remained largely exempt due to ancient privilege. Colbert famously warned the king that he would die of hunger for having wanted to appear too rich. Louis, however, did not heed the warning. He revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, persecuting the remaining Protestants and forcing the emigration of tens of thousands of skilled workers and merchants, a major economic blow delivered for the sake of religious conformity and personal piety. By the end of Louis XIV's staggering 72-year reign, the House of Bourbon was simultaneously the most powerful dynasty in Europe and the most financially vulnerable. The king had achieved absolute power, eliminating every check that might have prevented his descendants from inheriting an utterly broken fiscal system. The magnificence of Versailles was a thin, gilded veneer over a mountain of debt and a restive, overtaxed populace. In 1715, the Sun King died, leaving France not only exhausted by war and debt, but also structurally unable to reform itself, without dismantling the very privileges, especially the tax exemptions for the nobility, that his system was built on. He bequeathed a legacy of power without prudence, and a throne so grand that it was too expensive to maintain. His death was greeted in Paris not with mourning, but with a silent, palpable sigh of relief. The burden of the Sun King's ambition now fell on his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV. The seeds of the revolution were now deeply sown in the meticulously manicured gardens of Versailles.
The great halls of Versailles, for all their dazzling glory, could not halt the relentless march of Europe's death. The gold leaf, the endless silks, the mirrored reflections of royal power, all paused, breathless,
on a single agonizing question that was being decided not in Paris, but in Madrid. Charles II of Spain, known grimly as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, due to his severe physical and mental infirmities, was dying without an heir. With his passing, the vast, sprawling Spanish Empire, a crown that ruled not just the Iberian Peninsula, but Naples, Milan, the Spanish Netherlands, and the majority of the Americas, stood to be inherited, shattering the fragile balance of European power. Louis XIV, the ultimate architect of absolute monarchy, saw the succession crisis not as a threat, but as a final magnificent prize. The last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, was his first cousin and his sister-in-law's nephew. Critically, Louis's own mother, Anne of Austria, was a Spanish infanta. The claim was familial and dynastic, a final, towering achievement for the House of Bourbon. In October 1700, the moment arrived. Charles II signed a will naming Louis XIV's second grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou, as his sole heir. The news arrived at Versailles like a thunderclap. Philippe was a quiet 17-year-old prince, overshadowed by his elder brother and grandfather, destined for a minor gilded life in France. Now, he was the King of Spain. Louis XIV was ecstatic, yet cautious. He knew this act would plunge Europe into war. The Austrian Habsburgs also had a strong claim and would never tolerate a Bourbon hegemony stretching from the Rhine to the Pacific. England and the Netherlands, fearing a crushing Franco-Spanish commercial and military alliance, were already mobilizing. The choice was between dynastic ambition and the solvency of the state. Having spent his entire reign proving the king was the state, Louis made the inevitable, fateful decision. On November 16, 1700, the elderly king presented his grandson to the court. "Gentlemen," Louis XIV declared, his voice ringing across the Hall of Mirrors, "here is the King of Spain." Then he delivered the line that defined the geopolitical tragedy of the Bourbon dynasty. Il n'y a plus de Pyrénées. The Pyrenees no longer exist. France and Spain were, politically, one house. But the young Philip, now Philip V of Spain, saw no unity but only exile. He was forced to immediately depart from the luxurious, familiar court of his grandfather, to trade the French language for the archaic Spanish of Madrid, and to exchange the casual decadence of Versailles for the cold, rigid, and deeply traditional piety of the Spanish court. He was going to reign over an empire that was geographically vast, but financially exhausted and politically paralyzed. The very poisoned chalice Louis XIV's pragmatism had forced upon him. The prophecy of war was swift. Within months, the Spanish Succession War erupted, 1701 to 1714. It was not a grand campaign of glory, but a crushing, grinding humiliation for the French Bourbon state. For over a decade, the armies of France were beaten relentlessly by the genius of Britain's Duke of Marlborough and Austria's Prince Eugene of Savoy. French armies were routed at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Malplaquet, battles that stripped Louis XIV of his military aura and bled the French treasury dry. The war revealed the structural fragility underlying the Sun King's absolute power. To keep Philip V on his distant throne, France was bankrupted. By 1709, the French populace was starving. Louis XIV's eldest son and grandson were dead, and the enemy was threatening Paris. The king himself was forced to melt down royal plate to pay the soldiers. He was reduced to begging the enemy for peace. But the Allies' condition was simple. Louis must personally send his troops to drive his own grandson out of Spain. The Sun King, defeated, refused this ultimate familial betrayal, preferring to fight on.
The war only ended because the Whig government fell in Britain, and critically because the Austrian claimant to the Spanish throne suddenly inherited the Austrian Empire itself. The specter of a united Habsburg Empire was as terrifying to Britain as a united Bourbon one. The power shift forced a compromise. The resulting peace, codified in the treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt, 1713 and 1714, formalized the split that Louis XIV had tried to deny. Philip V was confirmed as the King of Spain and the Indies, securing the Bourbon name in Madrid, a lineage that endures to this day. However, the cost was crippling. The Great Renunciation. Philip V was forced to renounce for himself and his descendants any and all claim to the French throne. The two Bourbon crowns were legally separated forever. Territorial losses. Spain ceded the Spanish Netherlands to Austria, Sicily to Savoy, and most painfully Gibraltar and Minorca to Great Britain, shattering its Mediterranean dominance. France was forced to cede several North American territories to Britain, weakening its colonial reach. By sacrificing nearly everything, Louis XIV managed to establish the House of Bourbon in Madrid, but the cost to the French state was existential. The war alone added a colossal debt burden, a permanent, unmanageable fiscal cancer to the treasury already drained by Versailles. Louis XIV prioritized dynastic pride, placing a Bourbon in Madrid over the financial stability of his own kingdom. He died in 1715, leaving behind a 5-year-old heir, Louis XV, and a France that was bankrupt, militarily humbled, and politically isolated. The French Bourbons achieved their dynastic glory, but at the expense of their nation's future. The enduring Spanish Bourbons were established, but only as a dependent, perpetually compromised dynasty, forever separated from their origin. The two houses, split by a single desperate war, now faced entirely different fates. One, the path to the guillotine; the other, the long, troubled path of endurance.
The death of the Sun King in 1715 inaugurated the reign of Louis XV, a period marked not by spectacular collapses, but by a slow, agonizing hemorrhage of Bourbon authority. The transition from the terrifying "I am the state" absolutism of Louis XIV to the indolent, ineffective rule of his successor was the true inciting incident of the French Revolution. It demonstrated that the French monarchy, stripped of a great personal will, was structurally incapable of functioning or adapting. Louis XV, known later as le bien-aimé, the well-beloved, only to become le mal-aimé, the poorly beloved, inherited a throne crushed by debt and a state paralyzed by entrenched privilege. The young king was initially overseen by a long regency under his uncle, Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, who briefly relaxed the severity of Louis XIV's puritanical court, but failed to address the central fiscal crisis. The infamous Mississippi Bubble, a disastrous financial scheme championed by Scottish economist John Law during the Regency, briefly promised wealth but collapsed spectacularly, annihilating the fortunes of thousands of investors and cementing the public's deep-seated distrust of royal finances. When Louis XV finally took personal control, he was handsome, intelligent, and initially eager to rule, but the weight of the crown proved too heavy, and the rigid, suffocating formalism of Versailles, coupled with the legacy of his great-grandfather's debt, quickly eroded his resolve. The king possessed a natural inclination toward privacy and melancholia, preferring hunting and intellectual pursuits to the grueling public spectacle required of an absolute monarch. Louis XIV had made the king's life a theatrical performance. Louis XV refused to perform. He began retreating into his private apartments, the Petit Appartement,
leaving the affairs of state to various ministers and fatefully to his mistresses, who became unofficial, often corrupt political brokers. The most famous of these mistresses, Madame de Pompadour, exerted enormous influence over 2 decades. Though she was a great patron of the arts and the Enlightenment thinkers, even protecting Diderot, her position fueled popular resentment. To the starving Parisian populace and the politically sidelined aristocracy, it appeared that the destiny of France was being decided not by divine right, but by the king's paramour. The pamphlets and satirical songs, the libelles, circulated widely, viciously criticizing the whoreocracy that drained the public purse for jewelry, dresses, and chateaux. This erosion of moral authority was arguably more devastating than the fiscal deficit. In foreign policy, Louis XV's reign was marked by catastrophic losses. The War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, yielded French military victories, but was concluded with the king's famous, arrogant, and ruinous decision to hand back all territorial gains in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. "I prefer to play the king, not the merchant," he allegedly declared, sacrificing national interest for a meaningless gesture of royal superiority. This folly was immediately followed by the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. This global conflict, which the French referred to as the French and Indian War in North America, was an unmitigated disaster for the French Bourbons. France lost virtually all of its vast North American holdings, including Canada, and much of its influence in India, ceding global supremacy to Great Britain. The immense military defeats further compounded the national debt, forced the crown to contract ruinous loans, and destroyed any remaining belief in the king's competence. The political institutions, created by Louis XIV to be subservient, now actively hindered reform. The Parlement, high courts, which had the power to register royal edicts, repeatedly refused to ratify tax reforms proposed by ministers like Choiseul and Maupeou that would have forced the nobility and clergy to bear their share of the debt. The Parlement, though they defended their own noble privileges, positioned themselves as the champions of the people against royal tyranny, gaining massive popular support. The king, too weak to enforce his will, often simply let the necessary reforms die. Louis XV's legacy was that of paralysis. He recognized the danger, famously warning his grandson, "The machine is old. It will rattle on a while yet, but I doubt it will last my successor." He saw the collapse coming, but lacked the political will and stamina to prevent it. He died in 1774, not beloved, but hated, succumbing to smallpox. His body had to be rushed to the Basilica of Saint-Denis without ceremony, fearing the celebratory riots that might erupt in Paris. The Ancien regime that Louis XV passed on was structurally bankrupt, defeated on the global stage, and ruled by a dynasty whose moral standing had been utterly destroyed by the cynicism of court life. The people of France no longer saw a divinely appointed sovereign, but a distant hedonistic figure responsible for their poverty. The stage was now set for his grandson, Louis XVI, to inherit the full, crushing weight of the 15th, the combined debt, the political paralysis, and the immense, burning resentment that would fuel the coming storm. The revolution was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, awaiting a single catalyst.
The moment of succession in 1774 was a fleeting, hollow triumph. The new king, Louis XVI, was 20 years old, heavily built, and possessed a decent, if hesitant, nature. He was morally upright, genuinely pious, and deeply interested in intellectual pursuits, particularly locksmithing, geography, and naval history, qualities that would have made him an excellent scholar or engineer, but which proved fatal to a Bourbon king required to command attention and awe. The overwhelming public debt, the political paralysis, and the public's ingrained cynicism, the collective weight of the 15th settled immediately upon his shoulders. But the true catalyst for the final bloody fall of the French monarchy was his wife, the 15-year-old Dauphine who became queen, Marie Antoinette. She had arrived in France in 1770 as part of the diplomatic maneuver known as the Reversal of Alliances, a strategic effort to cement peace between the Bourbons and their longtime rivals, the Habsburgs of Austria. Her mother was the redoubtable Empress Maria Theresa. The marriage was a cold political contract, and from the moment she crossed the French border, Marie Antoinette was met with a mixture of awe and immediate deep suspicion. To the French people, she was la Autrichienne, the Austrian woman. The very alliance she symbolized was unpopular, and the memory of the long, costly wars against Austria was still fresh. She was immediately scrutinized under the hypercritical lens of the Parisian public. Her initial difficulties in conceiving an heir, a medical issue later attributed to the king, which was eventually resolved, only intensified the whispers of the court, fueling the vicious, widely circulated libels that questioned her character, piety, and commitment to France. The Queen, trapped in the restrictive, bewildering ritual of Versailles, a palace built by Louis XIV specifically to neuter political spontaneity, reacted to her isolation with a desperate search for freedom and pleasure. She spurned the ancient, cumbersome court ceremonies, preferring the relaxed atmosphere of her private retreat, the Petit Trianon. There she constructed her own idealized world, complete with a model farm and rustic hamlet, allowing her to play the role of a simple shepherdess. While harmless in intent, this retreat was disastrous in its political effect. It alienated the traditional French nobility who had been exiled to Versailles to participate in the court ritual. More crucially, it confirmed the public's worst suspicions. At a time when the masses starved, the Queen was seen as frivolously wasting fortunes on diamond necklaces, lavish balls, and the latest Parisian fashions, all while being sheltered from the reality of the crisis by the walls of the Trianon. The Queen's perceived extravagance and foreignness gave the political opposition, the parlements and the Enlightenment intellectuals, a human, visceral target for all the ills of the Ancien Regime. The debt was not simply a structural fiscal problem, it was Marie Antoinette's fault. The money was being shipped to Austria or spent on her vanity. This popular, deeply held belief, though largely untrue, as the debt was the legacy of Louis XIV and Louis XV's wars, was the final critical element in the Bourbon downfall, the complete loss of public empathy and trust. Louis XVI, for his part, struggled valiantly with the debt. He appointed a succession of brilliant finance ministers, Turgot, Necker, and Calonne, all of whom proposed the only viable solution, taxing the privileged classes, the nobility and clergy. Each time the plan was the same, broaden the tax base, and each time the plan failed. The parlements, the high courts dominated by the privileged tax-exempt nobility, refused to register the edicts, claiming the king had no right to levy such taxes without consulting the nation's representatives. Louis XVI possessed the legal right, but not the political strength to force the issue. He tried to circumvent them, he exiled them, and he recalled them. Every attempt at reform only served to highlight the fundamental political paralysis created by Louis XIV's system. The absolute monarch was financially trapped by the very privileged classes he had created. By 1787, the fiscal crisis was a systemic collapse. Minister Calonne informed the king that the state was on the brink of bankruptcy and that further loans were impossible. Desperate, Louis XVI convened the Assembly of Notables, a gathering of high-ranking nobles and clergy, in a final fruitless attempt to gain support for tax reform. They refused, demanding the convocation of the Estates General, the ancient legislative body that represented the three social classes of France and had not met since 1614. The demand for the Estates General was the final, irreversible turning point. The nobility, in a final short-sighted act of self-preservation, had inadvertently handed power to the very people who would dismantle them. They wanted the Estates General to limit royal absolutism. The Third Estate would use it to destroy the Ancien Régime entirely. Louis XVI, cornered by bankruptcy and a political maneuver he did not fully understand, conceded. The Queen's foreignness and the King's hesitation created the political vacuum. The dynasty that had claimed divine right was now being forced to negotiate its survival with its subjects. In doing so, the king admitted that which his ancestors had died to deny, that his authority was conditional. The date was set for May 1789. The stage was complete. The main actors were in place. The curtain was about to rise on the Bourbon family's final, grand tragedy.
The summer of 1789 began with a brittle, false sense of hope. In May, the Estates General convened at Versailles, the first time the body had met since 1614. Louis XVI, dressed in silks and velvet, opened the session with a tone of distant paternalism, lecturing the deputies on the need for obedience and focusing almost exclusively on the need to stabilize the crown's finances. He completely missed the seismic shift in the nation's political consciousness. The Third Estate, the representatives of the commoners, which included lawyers, merchants, and educated professionals, did not come to Versailles to discuss taxes. They came to discuss power. They demanded that voting occur by head, giving them a numerical advantage, rather than by order, which would allow the privileged first clergy and second nobility estates to always outvote them 2-1. The king refused, upholding the traditional, unequal structure. The conflict paralyzed the assembly. Tired of the deadlock, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly on June 17, asserting that it alone represented the sovereignty of the French nation. 3 days later, finding their usual meeting hall locked by royal order, the deputies gathered at a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they swore the famous tennis court oath, vowing not to disperse until they had given France a constitution. It was the first definitive act of revolutionary defiance, fundamentally shifting sovereignty from the king to the nation. Louis XVI, caught between the hardline reactionaries at court, led by his brother, the Count of Artois, and the Queen, and the revolutionary fervor outside, made his fatal move. Instead of engaging or negotiating, he prepared to use force. He dismissed his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker, whom the public viewed as their champion, and began ordering regiments of foreign mercenaries to converge on Paris and Versailles. The news of Necker's dismissal and the troop movements ignited the volatile Parisian populace. Paris, seething with hunger, debt, and political pamphlets, interpreted the king's actions as a planned military coup, a royal effort to dissolve the National Assembly by force. The people took up arms. On July 14, 1789, the culmination of 2 centuries of Bourbon absolutism reached its symbolic breaking point. Thousands of Parisians stormed the Bastille, the medieval fortress and royal prison, not to free its handful of political prisoners, but to seize its vast stores of gunpowder and weaponry. The governor, Bernard René de Launay, initially resisted, but eventually surrendered. He and several of his guards were murdered by the mob, their heads placed on pikes and paraded through the streets. The storming of the Bastille was more than a riot. It was a psychological earthquake. It demonstrated that the French people were willing to kill for their political rights and that the king's own army could not or would not suppress them. When Louis XVI was informed of the event by the Duke of La Rochefoucauld, he reportedly asked, "Is it a revolt?" "No, sire," the Duke replied in one of history's most chilling lines. "It is a revolution." The king, in an act of staggering political naivete, rode to Paris 2 days later, not with an army, but with a meager escort. He was met by a massive, silent, hostile crowd. He was forced to publicly accept a tricolor cockade, the revolutionary colors of red and blue for Paris, flanking the Bourbon white, a coerced admission that his authority was now subordinate to the city. The summer of 1789 intensified into the Great Fear. As royal authority evaporated, peasant revolts erupted across the countryside. Peasants, fearing a noble counterattack, attacked manor houses and crucially burned the documents, the ancient terriers, that recorded their feudal obligations and debts. Faced with the total breakdown of order, the National Assembly, in a feverish all-night session in August, completely abolished the feudal system, eliminating the tax exemptions, tithes, and ancient privileges of the nobility and clergy. The structure of the Ancien regime, the very foundation of Bourbon absolute rule, was legally dismantled in a single month. The king and queen, secluded in the fragile sanctity of Versailles, could not grasp the finality of the changes. The queen, especially, clung to the hope of intervention by her Austrian family. The king, hesitant and passive, spent his energy resisting the Assembly's decrees rather than accepting them as a new reality. The crisis peaked in October. Facing severe food shortages in Paris, thousands of working women, driven by hunger and rage, marched the 12 miles to Versailles. The Women's March on Versailles was a terrifying, visceral demand for bread and accountability. The mob breached the palace, slaughtering guards and rushing the Queen's apartments. Marie Antoinette was forced to flee for her life down a hidden corridor. The next morning, the crowd demanded that the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's little boy, the king, queen, and the dauphin, return to Paris. Louis XVI, once again forced into submission, rode back to the capital, his carriage flanked by thousands of armed, menacing Parisians carrying the heads of his murdered guards. The royal family was installed in the dilapidated Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris. The king had not only lost his absolute power, but also his physical freedom. He was now a prisoner of his own capital, forced to sign the very laws that destroyed his birthright. The first great reign of the French Bourbons, that of Henri IV through Louis XVI, was effectively over.
The royal family's life in the Tuileries Palace was a gilded cage, a humiliating charade where Louis XVI was constantly forced to ratify the revolutionary laws that dismantled his inheritance. The National Assembly was busy drafting the Constitution of 1791, which aimed to transform France into a constitutional monarchy, stripping the king of all legislative power and making him a mere executive servant of the nation. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, viewed this new reality as an unacceptable, temporary nightmare. Her correspondence with her brother, Emperor Leopold II of Austria, intensified. She pushed relentlessly for foreign intervention, seeing military force as the only way to restore the throne to its ancien absolute glory. The king, while slower to anger, was deeply pious and viewed the new constitutional requirement that the clergy swear loyalty to the state, the civil constitution of the clergy, as an act of sacrilege. This infringement on his religious conscience was the line Louis XVI could not cross. Together, the king and queen reached the tragic, irreversible decision: they must flee Paris. The plan, meticulously plotted in secret with the Swedish nobleman Axel von Fersen, a devoted admirer of the queen, was audacious, but fatally flawed by arrogance and poor logistics. The goal was to reach the heavily fortified royalist garrison at Montmedy, near the border with the Austrian Netherlands, where the king could place himself under the protection of loyal troops and subsequently renegotiate or even wage war against the National Assembly. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family, disguised as common travelers, with the king posing as a valet and the queen as a governess, slipped out of the Tuileries. They abandoned the tradition of small, swift carriages for a massive, custom-built berline, a luxury carriage so large it was slow, easily recognizable, and constantly delayed by the muddy roads. This decision, prioritizing comfort and status over security, perfectly encapsulated the Bourbon inability to grasp the gravity of their situation. The flight proceeded smoothly until the following afternoon. At the village of Saint-Menehould, the king, either through nervousness or an arrogant assumption of anonymity, revealed his face to the local postmaster, Jean-Baptiste Drouet. Drouet recognized the king's profile from the image printed on the new French assignats, paper currency. Drouet immediately alerted the authorities, and knowing the cumbersome royal carriage would take time to reach the next post, rode ahead on horseback by a shorter, faster path. The pursuit caught up with the royal family late that night in the small, unsuspecting town of Varennes. The carriage was stopped and surrounded by a hurriedly gathered local militia. Louis XVI, finally confronted, was forced to admit his identity. He had been within an hour's ride of safety, his loyal troops waiting just beyond the bridge. The failure was agonizingly close. The news reached Paris the next morning, causing political pandemonium. For the first time, the fiction that the king was merely being misled by wicked courtiers was shattered. His flight was an undeniable act of treason and defiance against the nation. The Assembly immediately suspended the king's powers. The journey back to Paris was a 3-day-long march of humiliation. The royal carriage was escorted by tens of thousands of armed soldiers and enraged citizens. As they passed through towns, the silence was chilling. Parisians were ordered not to cheer, not to applaud, and not to mock, simply to stare in cold, damning judgment. The flight to Varennes was the point of no return. Its consequences were absolute. Sovereignty confirmed. The king had attempted to flee the nation had brought him back. It confirmed that national sovereignty rested not with the monarch, but with the people and their representatives. The end of the monarchy, the belief in the person of the king, the crucial symbolic power of the Bourbon crown, was irrevocably destroyed. He was no longer a sacred, divine figure, but a conspirator, a runaway prisoner, and a traitor. The constitutional monarchy was now a meaningless concept. Rise of republicanism. Before Varennes, few openly advocated for a republic. Afterward, voices calling for the deposition and trial of the king became loud and dominant, finding a champion in radical figures like Maximilien Robespierre. Though the National Assembly attempted to salvage the constitutional monarchy by concocting the unbelievable fiction that the king had been kidnapped, the truth was apparent. Louis XVI was forced to swear an oath to the new constitution in September 1791, but it was an oath without meaning. Europe, led by Marie Antoinette's brother and the King of Prussia, issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, threatening intervention if the Bourbons were harmed. This only confirmed the suspicions of a foreign-backed conspiracy, further accelerating the move toward war. Louis XVI was now a king without a kingdom, a prisoner waiting for his fate to be decided not by divine right, but by the next surge of popular rage. By attempting to restore his absolute power, he had instead ensured its total destruction, setting the stage for the ultimate bloody confrontation.
The farce of the constitutional monarchy could not last. Trapped in Paris, Louis XVI's forced acceptance of the new laws was met with deep skepticism. especially as France, urged by the belligerent decrees of the revolutionary legislature, declared war on Austria in April 1792. This foreign war, intended to solidify the revolution, instead became the final explosive catalyst for the Republic. As French armies suffered initial humiliating defeats, the public rage intensified, fueled by the certainty that the Austrian Committee, the Queen and her circle, were secretly supplying the enemy with intelligence and orchestrating a foreign invasion to crush the revolution. The political atmosphere was poisonous. The whispers of treason were deafening. The final straw came with the Brunswick Manifesto in July 1792. Issued by the commander of the Prussian and Austrian armies, this decree threatened to inflict ever-memorable vengeance upon Paris if the royal family was harmed. Intended to protect the Bourbons, it had the opposite, catastrophic effect. It confirmed every revolutionary fear that the king was in league with the foreign enemy. Louis XVI was no longer merely weak, he was a defined traitor. On August 10, 1792, the climax of the confrontation arrived. A massive mob of Parisian radicals, led by the National Guard's revolutionary wing, the Fédérés, stormed the Tuileries Palace. The king and queen fled for safety to the hall of the Legislative Assembly, abandoning the palace to their final loyal defenders, the Swiss Guards. The subsequent battle was a short, brutal massacre. Hundreds of Swiss Guards were slaughtered, their bodies mutilated and paraded. The assault was the midpoint reversal of the series, the end of the monarchy in all but name. The Assembly, now controlled by the radicals, immediately suspended Louis XVI, imprisoned the entire royal family in the grim Temple Tower, and declared the establishment of a national convention to draft a new, purely republican constitution. The Bourbon crown had fallen, not to a dynasty, but to the people. The immediate consequence was the infamous September massacres, a terrifying wave of violence in which thousands of perceived royalists and political prisoners were murdered in the streets and prisons of Paris. The revolution was no longer constitutional, it was a tide of blood. The National Convention convened in September 1792 and immediately declared France a republic. The final crucial question was what to do with the former king, now merely referred to as Citizen Louis Capet. The radical faction, the Jacobins, led by men like Robespierre and Saint-Just, argued that the king must die, not merely as punishment, but as a political necessity. As Saint-Just famously stated, no one can reign innocently. The time of compromise has passed. We must kill the king, that the revolution may live. His execution would be an irreversible, definitive break with the past, demonstrating the total sovereignty of the Republic. Louis XVI's trial was a foregone conclusion, a political show trial rather than a legal proceeding. He was formally charged with conspiracy against public liberty and general safety of the state. The king defended himself with dignity, denying any intent to betray his people, but his past actions, the flight to Varennes, the secret correspondence, the reliance on foreign armies, were insurmountable evidence. The vote was agonizingly close, with a narrow majority condemning him to death. On the morning of January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was transported through the silent, cold streets of Paris to the Place de Révolution. He wore simple clothes and retained his characteristic composure. At the scaffold, he attempted to address the immense crowd, declaring, "I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me. I pardon the authors of my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed will never fall upon France." His voice was quickly drowned out by the drums of the Revolutionary Guard. The blade of the guillotine fell, ending 202 years of Bourbon rule in France. The execution was a shocking, irreversible act of regicide that stunned Europe. The great European powers, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Spain, ruled by the Bourbon cousin, Charles IV, coalesced into the first coalition, dedicating themselves to crushing the regicidal republic.
The war escalated from a territorial conflict to a life-or-death ideological struggle against the entire Ancien Regime. The French Revolution had now become the French Terror, driven by the blood of the king. Marie Antoinette followed him to the scaffold on October 16, 1793, after a similarly grotesque trial. Her execution extinguished the hope for a return to the pre-revolutionary order. The crown of France was literally gone, and the remaining Bourbon princes, Louis XVI's brothers, were scattered across Europe in poverty and exile, their hopes resting solely on the total defeat of the mighty French Republic. The world the Bourbons had built was over. The stage was now set for the long, difficult period of their eventual, fragile restoration, an attempt to resurrect a ghost.
The execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette was not the extinction of the French Bourbons, but the beginning of a long, desperate exile. The heir to the now liquidated throne was Louis XVI's surviving brother, the Comte de Provence. Recognizing the symbolic power of the dynasty, he immediately proclaimed himself Louis XVIII, honoring his nephew, the 10-year-old Dauphin, who was languishing and would soon die in the Temple Tower, as the rightful Louis XVII. This act of succession in absentia was a defiant assertion of legitimacy against the regicide republic. Louis XVIII was a man of immense appetite, both intellectual and physical, possessing an ironic wit and a deeply cynical understanding of politics. He was the figurehead of the émigrés, the thousands of noblemen and royalists scattered across Europe, all clinging to the dream of restoration. The court in exile shifted ceaselessly, from Verona to Mittau in Latvia, and finally to Hartwell House in England, dependent on the charity and strategy of Europe's great powers. For 2 decades, the Restoration appeared to be nothing more than a ghost of history. The French Republic, fueled by revolutionary zeal and later by the singular genius of Napoleon Bonaparte, conquered Europe. Louis XVIII watched from the sidelines as the Republic morphed into the First French Empire, with Napoleon, a Corsican artillery officer, crowning himself emperor in 1804. Napoleon was the ultimate symbol of the Bourbons' failure. He represented talent over birthright, efficiency over privilege, and modern military power over ancient divine right. For the émigrés, Napoleon was the usurper, the personification of the revolution's ultimate arrogance. Yet his legal codes and centralized administration simply perfected the state-building project begun by Louis XIV, albeit without the Bourbon name. Louis XVIII's strategy in exile was one of stubborn, unyielding waiting. He understood that he could not win his throne back by force. It would have to be delivered to him by the exhaustion of France and the intervention of the Allied coalition. He maintained his claim, issued verbose manifestos that alienated Frenchmen by promising a return to ancient regime privileges, and ultimately survived the era simply by enduring. The opportunity finally arrived in 1814. Napoleon, after years of endless warfare and the disastrous invasion of Russia, was finally defeated by the combined armies of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The Allied powers, seeking a stable, internationally recognized government for France that would accept reduced borders and guarantee peace, chose the only option that promised legitimacy, the return of the ancient Bourbon house. Louis XVIII arrived in Paris in May 1814. His return was managed and engineered entirely by the Allies, not by a royalist uprising. He was accompanied by his younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, the future Charles X, and his niece, Marie-Thérèse, the only surviving child of Louis XVI. Louis XVIII's restoration was immediately fragile. He was acutely aware that he was King of France by the grace of foreign bayonets. He quickly issued the Charter of 1814, a surprisingly pragmatic document. It was not a grant of power from the people, but an octroyé, or granted, constitution from the king.
Crucially, the charter preserved most of the revolutionary gains: religious tolerance, the Napoleonic legal codes, and the guarantee that properties confiscated from the church and émigrés during the revolution would not be returned, ensuring the loyalty of the new propertied classes. Louis XVIII established a constitutional monarchy with an elected chamber of deputies, conceding that the age of absolute power was over. He had learned, if cynically, that a crown was worth a charter. The court, however, was immediately split. Louis XVIII and his chief minister, Talleyrand, were pragmatists. But the king's brother, the Comte d'Artois, and the émigrés who returned with him were known as the ultras, ultra-royalists. They had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. They viewed the charter as an insult and demanded an immediate, total reversal to the ancien regime, the restoration of privilege, the full power of the church, and vengeance against the revolutionaries. This internal tension between a king attempting fragile compromise and his own reactionary family and supporters was the defining weakness of the First Restoration. The memory of the Republic and the sheer power of Napoleon were still potent forces, and the Bourbon return was greeted with suspicion and resentment by the millions who had served the empire. The stage was set for the ultimate, crushing challenge to the Bourbons' second chance, a challenge that would prove their new reign was merely a fleeting interlude, not a lasting peace.
The fragile peace of the Bourbon Restoration was shattered in an event that proved the depth of the dynasty's political instability: the return of Napoleon. The exiled emperor, chafing in his miniature kingdom on the island of Elba, watched the rising discontent in France and recognized the weakness of the restored crown. The French populace resented the return of the émigrés and their arrogance, and the army, filled with veteran soldiers who still wore the tricolor cockade beneath their Bourbon white, despised being commanded by noblemen who had fled the revolution. Napoleon's plot was audacious. On February 26, 1815, he slipped away from Elba with a small force of fewer than 1,000 men. Landing on the southern coast of France on March 1, he began his march north, an event that became known as the 100 Days. Louis XVIII, comfortably settled in the Tuileries Palace, initially dismissed the news as a minor police matter. His court, the ultras, assured him that the people loved their legitimate king and would rise up against the Corsican ogre. The truth was devastatingly swift and brutal. Napoleon's march was a triumph of psychological warfare. He avoided the royalist centers and marched through the countryside, where his presence was greeted with ecstatic popular support. Most critically, he encountered no resistance from the army. At Grenoble, Napoleon famously confronted the royal troops sent to arrest him. Stepping forward alone, he dramatically opened his coat and shouted, "If there is a soldier among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." The response was an immediate, overwhelming roar of "Vive l'Empereur!" The entire regiment defected. The march became a massive, snowballing defection. Regiments sent to capture Napoleon simply joined his banner. The most humiliating blow came from Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVIII that he would bring back the usurper in an iron cage, only to embrace his former emperor days later and lead his forces into Napoleon's growing army. The event exposed the true, terrifying weakness of the restored Bourbons. They lacked any genuine internal support. Their legitimacy rested entirely on ancient claims and foreign treaties, not on the loyalty of the French people or its institutions. Louis XVIII had made no connection with the nation. In Paris, panic erupted. The royal government collapsed not from a battle, but from internal betrayal and fear. On the night of March 19, 1815, Louis XVIII, recognizing the inevitable, was forced to flee the Tuileries Palace. He rode ignominiously toward Ghent in the Netherlands, taking with him his few remaining loyalists, and once again relying on the kindness of the Allied powers. The climax of the series, the final decisive confrontation for the French throne, was set not in Paris,
but on the fields of Belgium. Napoleon ruled for a glorious but short 100 days, frantically trying to rally the nation and preempt the inevitable massive counterattack by the Allies. The final act of the drama occurred on June 18, 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo. Facing the armies of the Duke of Wellington and Prince Blucher, Napoleon was decisively defeated. The battle was a bloody, total rout that ended the empire forever. The victory immediately paved the way for the second and far more conservative Bourbon Restoration. Louis XVIII was escorted back to Paris under the protection of the Allied armies. This second return solidified the public perception that the Bourbon king was a creature of foreign powers, incapable of ruling without external military force. The Second Restoration began with an atmosphere of vengeful paranoia known as the White Terror. The Ultras, led by the Comte d'Artois, seized control. They demanded and received the execution of leading Bonapartists, including Marshal Ney. The subsequent government stripped the rights of many Bonapartists and revolutionaries and increased the political power of the conservative nobility. Louis XVIII, weary but still pragmatic, attempted to manage the extremists in his court. He had learned that the throne was precarious. His brother, however, had learned nothing. Louis XVIII understood that the French soil was too volatile for pure reaction. However, the final chapter of the French Bourbon story was already written. The 100 Days' Nightmare demonstrated that the dynasty was merely a footnote to the revolution and the empire, a weak interlude sustained only by European bayonets. The memory of Napoleon remained a powerful, potent challenge to their legitimacy. When Louis XVIII died peacefully in 1824, he passed the crown to his younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, a man who would attempt to fully realize the reactionary dream, and in doing so, commit the final, fatal folly of the House of Bourbon.
When Louis XVIII died in 1824, the crown passed to his younger brother, the Count d'Artois, who now reigned as Charles X. This transfer of power was the final, critical error of the French Bourbon line. If Louis XVIII had been a cynical pragmatist determined to keep the throne through compromise, Charles X was the unyielding standard-bearer of the Ultras, the party of extreme royalism. He was the man who had declared he had learned nothing and forgotten nothing of the revolution. He saw his accession not as a constitutional duty, but as a divine mandate to fully restore the ancien régime and expunge the stain of regicide and revolution. His reign was an unbroken series of attempts to undo the last 35 years of French history, a political blindness that ignored the fundamental changes in French society. Charles X was crowned in the traditional medieval ceremony at Reims, an act of defiant piety meant to reassert the divine connection between king and church. This symbolism, however, was perceived by the liberal and intellectual Parisian populace as a return to outdated superstition and clerical dominance. His first major legislative act was the Law of Indemnity, 1825, which compensated the émigrés, the nobles who had fled the revolution, for the lands and property they had lost. While morally satisfying to the royalists, the law cost the state 1 billion francs, money which was raised by converting the national debt. This massive transfer of wealth confirmed the fears of the burgeoning middle-class property owners and peasants that the Bourbons intended to dismantle the legal and economic gains of the revolution. It was viewed as theft, punishing the nation for the crimes of the nobility. Charles X further alienated the military and the liberals by attempting to restore the full power of the Catholic Church. He passed the law on sacrilege, which prescribed the death penalty for the profanation of sacred vessels, effectively making the Church a state power again. This clericalism deeply offended the anti-clerical, skeptical, and rationalist sentiments of the revolutionary and Napoleonic generations. The political situation spiraled downward
as the king and his chief minister, the ultra-reactionary Prince de Polignac, grew increasingly dismissive of the elected legislature, the Chamber of Deputies. The chamber, dominated by liberal and constitutional monarchist opposition, constantly challenged the king's ministers. Charles X viewed this opposition not as legitimate political discourse, but as revolutionary insubordination. He believed, as Louis XIV had, that the king's will was law, and that constitutional limits were beneath him. The crisis reached its peak in March 1830, when the Chamber of Deputies presented the king with an address that effectively stated the king's ministers did not have the confidence of the legislature. Charles X's response was immediate and fatal. He dissolved the chamber and called for new elections. When the new elections returned an even stronger liberal majority, Charles X was faced with a choice: either accept the constitutional reality of a strong legislature or revert to the absolutist principles of his ancestors. He chose the latter. On July 25, 1830, Charles X, invoking the royal prerogative established by the Bourbons in the 17th century, signed the Four Ordinances of Saint Cloud. This act of final folly was the direct, deliberate cause of his second and permanent downfall. The ordinances decreed the suspension of the liberty of the press, effectively reinstating censorship; the dissolution of the newly elected Chamber of Deputies, an act of arbitrary illegality; the change of the electoral law, disenfranchising most of the middle class and restricting the vote solely to wealthy landowners; the calling of new elections under the new restrictive rules. These decrees were a direct unconstitutional attack on the constitutional charter that Louis XVIII had granted. They were a revolutionary challenge from the throne itself. The reaction was immediate. Parisian journalists and opposition leaders, recognizing the death of the Constitution, refused to comply. On July 27, 1830, the streets of Paris erupted in what became known as the Three Glorious Days, Trois Glorieuses, the July Revolution. Students, journalists, artisans, and workers threw up barricades across the city. The king's military, alienated by the ultras, showed little enthusiasm for fighting the populace. Unlike his brother, Louis XVI, Charles X was not in Paris. He was at Saint Cloud and chose to remain outside the city, paralyzed by indecision and bad counsel. By July 29th, the rebels had seized control of the Tuileries Palace and the royal symbols of power. The great institutions, the bankers, politicians, and intellectuals quickly moved to channel the popular revolt away from a radical republic and towards a more palatable constitutional compromise. They offered the throne not to the legitimate Bourbon heir, the young Count of Chambord, but to the king's cousin, Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans, of a cadet Bourbon line, a man with liberal leanings who had fought for the revolution in his youth. On August 2, 1830, Charles X, in a final gesture of dynastic piety, abdicated in favor of his 10-year-old grandson, the Count of Chambord, and appointed Louis-Philippe as regent. It was too late. Louis-Philippe accepted the title of King of the French by the will of the people, not the grace of God, a direct rejection of the Bourbon divine right. Charles X, the last true king of the senior French Bourbon line, was forced into exile, completing the flight that his grandfather, Louis XVI, had attempted and failed in 1791. He crossed the Channel to England, ending his days in quiet obscurity. The senior French line of the Bourbons had lost the throne forever, proving their inability to adapt. The dynasty had been swept away by the same revolutionary forces unleashed by the arrogance of Louis XIV and the indecision of Louis XVI, now ignited by the final fatal folly of his successor.
The final ignominious flight of Charles X in 1830 permanently ended the direct,
senior line of the French House of Bourbon. The throne of France, after a brief experiment with the liberal cadet branch of Louis-Philippe of Orléans, who was himself deposed in 1848, was lost entirely, claimed briefly by a second republic and then a second empire under another Bonaparte, before settling into the long stasis of the Third Republic. The grand dynasty that had built Versailles and declared itself synonymous with France was relegated to the historical record, its remaining legitimate pretenders living out their lives in quiet, futile exile. The final irony of the entire Bourbon saga, however, was not in the demise of the French line, but in the improbable endurance of the Spanish line. The line established in Chapter 3 by Philip V, the grandson of Louis XIV, who was forced to renounce the French throne, proved to be the more resilient, surviving centuries of internal conflict, external pressure, and even the threat of the total revolution that had consumed its French progenitor. While the French Bourbons were being swept away by the July Revolution, the Spanish Bourbons, under Ferdinand VII, the grandson of Charles IV, were simultaneously navigating their own deep crises. Spain, too, had faced revolutionary turmoil and foreign invasion, namely the devastating Napoleonic Wars, which saw Napoleon replace the Spanish Bourbon king with his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. But unlike in France, the Spanish populace had often rallied to the side of the legitimate Bourbon king against the foreign French invader. When Ferdinand VII was restored in 1814, he was genuinely popular, though he quickly proved to be a reactionary tyrant, abolishing the Constitution and plunging Spain into political instability. The Spanish Bourbons, despite their own political flaws, survived the 19th century through a dizzying series of civil wars, the Carlist Wars, revolutions, and short-lived republics, because the political forces arrayed against them in Spain were never as unified or as dominant as the Parisian revolutionary movement had been against Louis XVI. The Catholic Church and the entrenched conservative elements in Spanish society provided a deep, conservative anchor that the anti-clerical French line had lost. The throne of Spain was ultimately lost to a Republican revolution in 1931, forcing King Alfonso XIII into exile, a parallel moment to the French Bourbons' own final flight. The dynasty appeared to be over. Yet the story does not end there. Spain was subsequently consumed by the brutal Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, and ruled for decades by the fascist dictator General Francisco Franco. Franco, committed to authoritarian tradition and the monarchy as a symbol of national unity, designated Alfonso XIII's grandson, Juan Carlos, as his official successor. Upon Franco's death in 1975, King Juan Carlos I ascended the throne. He did not reign as a dictator, however, but immediately used the immense power granted to him by Franco to dismantle the dictatorship and establish a fully functioning parliamentary democracy. In 1981, he personally intervened to stop a military coup, cementing his role as the guardian of Spanish democracy. This final pivotal act, the deliberate, self-imposed limitation of power by a Bourbon king, was the ultimate, profound contrast to the arrogance and rigidity that had defined the French line. The French Bourbons, from Louis XIV to Charles X, were destroyed because they refused to transition from divine right to constitutional monarchy. The Spanish Bourbons survived and were restored because their most recent king chose legitimacy through democracy over absolute power. Today, the House of Bourbon, through the Spanish line, reigns in Madrid under King Felipe VI, Juan Carlos I's son. The dynasty also reigns in Luxembourg, House of Bourbon Parma, and remains one of Europe's most enduring. The echoes of the French failure.
The legacy of the House of Bourbon is therefore one of staggering ironic contrast. The dynasty that lost France, the most ambitious and powerful branch, which sought absolute authority, was utterly destroyed by the very national forces it created and alienated. The dynasty that endured in Spain, the less glamorous subordinate branch, established through a massive sacrifice of French national power, survived 2 centuries of tumult, learned from the mistakes of its French cousins, and ultimately found its legitimacy in constitutional democracy, not divine right. The story of the French Bourbon dynasty serves as history's ultimate cautionary tale, a study in how an unchecked pursuit of glory and absolute privilege, maintained through political rigidity and culminating in catastrophic debt, inevitably leads to a violent reckoning. They built the most magnificent throne in Europe, only to find that its true price was their own heads. The crown was worth a mass to Henri IV, but the principles of the Enlightenment and the people's will proved to be worth a revolution, and the final, irrevocable end of the dynasty that lost France twice.